Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Reish Bem Daled Amid Beis. We pick up today on Reish Bem Daled Amid Aleph, 2 lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Ayin Daled Sif Daled. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Beis Yisrael Hanasudim Batzaru Bashivya Haim Dem Ben Bayom Ben Bayabasha Hamakom Mirachem Aleihem. V'yaitzia mitzara l'rvacha me'afelu la'oiro mishibud l'geula hashta b'agolo v'zman kariv v'nemar amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Achi Agadol Moshe ben Esther Fradel Yitzchak ben Sion ben Dusha Rivka b'Shira Leah Chavadasa bas Rezel Serel Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana and Yerucham ben Masha. They should all have refuah shalema b'sar Sharchel Yisrael, and we mispal that our learning should be a schus for all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. Okay, so Sif Daled is almost a repeat of some of what we learned in Sif Gimel. So let's just remind ourselves of the basic halacha that we learned in Sif Gimel. In Sif Gimel, we were talking about this case over here. We were talking about a chotzer gedola and a chotzer ketana that are open to each other. And in Sif Gimel, we said that if they each made their own independent Eruvei Chatzeros, and now they're open to each other, so we said, well, the Chotzer Gedola is mutter. The Chotzer Gedola could be metaltal, Kelim Sheshavsu Babayis, from their bottom to their Chotzer, Kelim Sheshavsu B'Chotzer to their bottom, from one bias to another bias. Why? Because we see the Chotzer Gedola, this one over here, we see the Chotzer Gedola as being cut off and closed to the Chotzer Ketana. Why do we see it that way? The reason we see it that way is because from the perspective of the Chotzer Gedola, you have these gifufim, you have these side walls that close, that are seem to be closing off the Chotzer Gedola from the Chotzer Ketana. Of course, in order for this to be true, this opening has to be less than 10 amos wide. If this opening was 10 amos wide, very nice that there are gifufim, there are partial walls here, but an opening that's more than 10 amos wide is not a Pesach. An opening that's more than 10 amos wide is a Pirza. It would negate whatever kaisel is created by their gifufim, and then the Chotzer Gedola would be seen as being nifratz to the Chotzer Ketana, and the Chotzer Ketana would aser on the Chotzer Gedola. Now, how about the Chotzer Ketana? Well, we said that the Chotzer Ketana is Aser. Even though they have their own independent Eruvei Chatzeros, they're Aser B'Tiltal, from their houses to their Chotzer, vice versa, from one bias to another. Why? Because they are Nifratz B'Miluai to the Gedola. Even if this opening is less than 10 amos wide, even if this opening is, let's say, 8 amos wide, but there's no mechitza left. The mechitza is completely breached from the perspective of the Ketana. Therefore, the Ketana is nifratz b'milua to the Gedola. They're considered open to the Gedola. The Gedola asers on them, and it voids the Eruvei Chatzeros that they made. Now, we threw in another detail, and that is, the Mechaber said, in order for this halacha to be true, these walls have to have extensions. The side walls of the Chotzer Ketana have to extend into the Chotzer Gedola on both sides, and those extensions have to be more than the sheer lavud removed from the side walls of the Chotzer Gedola. Why is that? And I'm repeating this for a reason, because it's going to come into play very soon. The reason for that is because without these extensions, even though from the perspective of the Ketana, there are no partial walls closing them off from the Gedola, right? From the perspective of the Ketana, when someone is standing here and looking this way, they don't see these partial walls. So from the perspective of the Ketana, there are no gifufim. They're nifratz b'miluai. However, since from the perspective of the Gedola, we do see these walls, right? We would apply the rule of shaveh mi bifnim v'nireh mi bachutz. Since from the perspective of the Gedola, we see gifufim, those gifufim would serve not only to cut the Gedola off from the Ketana, but also to cut the Ketana off from the Gedola. However, if we have these sidewall extensions, then even from the perspective of the Gedola, it's obvious that these gifufim, these partial side walls, are not there to serve the Ketana. They're not there to cut the Ketana off from the Gedola because they're bisected by the side walls of the Ktana. So that is a brief recap of what we learned yesterday. Now we move on to today, and today we're going to have what seems to be almost a complete repeat of that halacha in a slightly different scenario. Here's the scenario for today. Now right away you notice that the shape is exactly the same. But here we're not talking about two chatzeros in the traditional sense of what a chatzer is. Here we're talking about rooftops. So this over here is a building. This is one very big building over here. Next to it, there's another building. This over here is another building. And they're right next to each other. They're right next to each other so that the flat roof of this building, which we're calling the Gag Godol, the big roof, is opened up to the Gag Koton, to the small roof of the smaller building. Now, underneath these roofs are individual homes. So this is one private residence. This is another private residence. We know that in order to transfer from one Rishus HaYachid to another Rishus HaYachid, right, you need to have an Eruv Chatzeros between those two Rishus HaYachids, right? So now, the rooftops of these two houses are extensions of the homes beneath them. They're sort of Chatzeros from the homes that are beneath them. So if this building and this building did not join together in a joint Eruv Chatzeros, you cannot take an item from this rooftop and carry it onto this rooftop, because by doing so, what you're doing is you're going from one roof to the other. Now, here in this scenario, when it comes to these rooftops, we have the same situation as we had in yesterday's scenario of the two chatzeros. If this house and this house did not make an Eruv Chatzeros together, well then, when we go up on the roof of this house, what we see is kind of a chatzer. Remember that the outside walls of this building, we're going to apply the rule of good asik mechitzasa. So this outside wall of this big building is a mechitza. It's a wall that extends upwards to surround the roof. So to this wall, so to this wall, so to this wall, so to this wall. So when we're on the Gag Godol, we see ourselves as being surrounded by all of these mechitzas. Now, if this opening where the Gag Koton is next to the Gag Godol, if this is less than 10 amos wide, well, in that case, there's essentially a Pesach. There are mechitzos, these gifufim. We're going to call them gifufim, even though they're not physical gifufim. They're not real walls here. They're good asik mechitzasa walls. But we're going to see the Gag Godol as being cut off from the Gag Koton. Therefore, the Gag Koton is not going to aser on the Gag Godol. How does that help us? I'll tell you how it helps us. It helps us that the people who live in this house could transfer a keli sheshavsu babayis. They could take a dish or a cup from inside the house and they could bring it onto the roof. They're essentially taking a keli sheshavas babayis and they're transferring it to a chotzer because we're calling the gag their chotzer. So they could do that. Why? Because this chotzer, this gag koton, does not aser on them. However, from the perspective of the Gag Koton is nifratz b'milua to the Gag Godol, and therefore the people who live in this house cannot transfer a keli sheshavas babayis in their house below the roof out to the roof, because by doing so they're transferring a keli sheshavas babayis to a chotzer, and it's a chotzer she'ena mu'reves, because it is nifratz b'milua to this Gag, aka a chotzer, and they don't have a joint Eruv Chatzeros. Now, the one halacha that is not going to repeat itself today from yesterday is the question of the extensions. The reason that halacha is not going to apply over here is because the Chavetz Chaim tells us in the Sha'ar Tzion that it's very nice to say good asik mechitzasa, but we're not going to apply good asik mechitzasa on this wall and on that wall to the extent that we're going to call them gifufim and say that from the perspective of the Gag Godol looking to the Gag Koton, these gifufim create a situation of nire mibachutz and shava bibifnim. They're not nira mi bachutz. They're good asik mechitzasa mechitzais. They're halachic mechitzais, halacha l'moshe b'sinai mechitzais, but we can't see them. So even from the perspective of the Gag Gadol, we're not going to say, oh, it's nire mi bifnim, it's shave mi bifnim, but nire mi bachutz. No, it's not. And therefore, that question of nire mi shave mi bifnim, nire mi bachutz, extensions, lavud, etc., that is not going to play itself out in today's shir over here in Sif Dalet. Now, against that backdrop, let's see this inside. It says the Mechaber, Sif Dalet, 2 lines off the bottom, Reish Mem Dalet Amud Aleph. Gag Katan Shenifratz Kodim Shabbos B'Miluay LeGag Gadol. A Gag Katan that is opened, and it was already opened before Shabbos, B'Miluay, completely, LeGag Gadol, to a larger rooftop that is next to it. Let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah Chaf. Gag Katan, Aval Mishnah Gagin Shavin. If we don't have a Gag Gadol and a Gag Katan, if both of these houses are exactly the same size and the 2 rooftops are fully open to each other, then they're going to aser on each other, even if the opening where they meet each other is less than 10 amas, because it's different b'miluay from both sides. The phraseology of the Mechaber is Gag Katan Shenifratz. It became breached. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this phraseology is really a little bit awkward, and it's lav dafka. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chafal Shenifratz lav dafka. This is imprecise. The 2 rooftops are open to each other. We don't really expect a kaisel between the 2 rooftops. The nakat loshay nifratz ID to Sif Gimel. In Sif Gimel, we were talking about chatzeros. It's customary for 2 chatzeros to have a wall separating them. Apparently, it was not customary to have for the rooftops to have walls between them, and therefore it's really not so right to use the word nifratz. Point is, they're open to each other, and they were open to each other already before Shabbos. Because if there was a wall separating these 2 rooftops, and it was there before Shabbos, and it became breached on Shabbos, then Sif Beis would kick in. And we would say, since before Shabbos these 2 rooftops were separated from each other by a proper wall, by a proper kaisel of 10 tfachim, etc., and therefore each house is its own independent entity. If they needed a Ruvik Hatzeros, let's say there were multi-family dwellings, these 2 buildings with this rooftop, they could make their own independent Ruvik Hatzeros, and the other house is not going to aser, the other rooftop adjoining it is not going to aser anything, because when Ben Hashmashas came, when the Erev kicked in on Erev Shabbos, everything was okay. The small roof, the Gag Katan, was nifratz b'miluay. It was fully open to the Gag Gadol. The small Gag, the Gag Katan, was completely next to the Gag Gadol, so that it's very easy access. It's open from the Gag Katan to the Gag Gadol. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter. And these 2 houses did not join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. So now you have a case where these 2 houses, remember the rooftops are extensions, they're sort of Chatzeros of the houses, and they're open to each other. So now they're going to aser on each other. They could aser on each other. So it also has to be that the Gag Katan is not more than 10 amas wide. Because if the Gag Katan is more than 10 amas wide, then the opening between the Gag Katan and the Gag Gadol is more than 10 amas wide. In that case, we can't view that opening as being a Pesach. Then it's a complete breach. And then even the Gag Gadol is going to be aser for Kalim Sheshavsu Babayis, because it's completely breached to another chotzer, aka rooftop, next door. V'gam she'en Gag Katan masik yoisem yeser amas v'chanal besif gimel. Ois katan chav dalid. So we didn't see this yet. Let's go back into the chaber. So gag cotton shenifratz kodim Shabbos b'bilui legag gadol. Also lahalois alav kelim sheshafsu cotton. Also lahalois alav kelim sheshafsu babayis. The gag cotton, that house, they're not allowed to take a keli. They're not allowed to take a pirkei. They're not allowed to take a mug, a coffee cup. They're not allowed to take anything that started off Shabbos in the house under the gag and bring it up to the gag. Also, lahalisal of kelim sheshafsu babayis. The gadol mutter, but the gag gadol, that house is allowed to transfer kelim sheshafsu babayis to the rooftop. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois cotton chavdal, cotton also lahalois, tarei nifratz l'rishos chaverei also, because this rooftop is opened up to the next door roof. It's opened up to the gag gadol, so the gag gadol is answering on it. Ois cotton chafei sheshavsu babayis, dilu kelim sheshavsu ala gag. If you keep lawn chairs up on the roof, mutal l'taltal l'mafilu l'gag chaverei b'leir of klal v'chanal b'simin shenayin beis aleph. You could transfer something that started off Shabbos on one rooftop. You could transfer it even to the neighboring rooftop, because we're looking at these rooftops as chatzeros. You're allowed to transfer from one chatzer to another chatzer without a problem. Oiskan chavav, the gadol mutter, but the big house that has the big roof, they could transfer kelim sheshavsu babayis to the rooftop. Lahoitzi klei abayis al gagoy the gaga cotton l'gabei neshav kepesach ba'alma, because from their perspective, where they meet the gag cotton is only a doorway. It's less than 10 amas wide. From the gag cotton's perspective, it's nifratz bibilui, but not from the gag gadol's perspective, right? The gag gadol is wider. It's got those, for lack of a better phrase, we're going to call them gifufim. So the gag gadol is not nifratz bibilui to the gag cotton, and this opening is less than 10 amas wide, so it's a pesach, and therefore the gag cotton is not going to aser on the gag gadol. Whoops, I lost the. Yeah. So gadol mutter loisi klei bayis al gagoy. The gag cotton legabei neshav kepesach ba'alma came into ein bayoser me eser amos. Continues the mechaber top line reish mem dalad bebeis. For who sheyu mechitzais abayis nikarois lemisha omed al agag. But of course, this whole halacha only starts if the outside walls of the house are nicker, if they're visible from the top of the roof. Remember, the only reason we're looking at these rooftops as being a rishos hayachid is because they're considered to be surrounded by mechitzos. Why are they considered to be surrounded by mechitzos? Because of good asik mechitzasa. We take the outside walls of the building and we extend them upwards to say that they're surrounding the rooftop. But that only works if they're mechitzos nikaros. What does that mean that they're mechitzos nikaros? Says the mechaber, v'yu sheyu mechitzabais nikaros l'mishayimin alagag avalim einam nikaros. But if those outside walls of the buildings are not nicker from the rooftop, what's that case? Kigoin, for example, shahagag boileit aleihem. If the roof line extends past the walls, so you have a roof that juts out. So when you're standing down on the sidewalk and you look up, you see the underside of the roof because the roof line extends outward beyond the walls. In that case, when you're standing up on top on the surface of the roof, the outside walls of the building are not nicker. You walk to the edge of the roof, which is over here, it's beyond the walls, and you look down, you don't see these walls. They're under the roof. So then the mechitzas are not nicker. When the mechitzas are not nicker, you cannot say good asik mechitzasa. Kigoin shagag boilet aleim, then heavy carmelis. Then the rooftop is not a rishus hayachid. The rooftop is a carmelis. It's not mukaf mechitzais. It's more than dalad al dalad. It's more than 10 tfachim tall, but we can't say god asik. Then the rooftop is a carmelis. Elim kein pasuach le me'abayis chaloin arba al arba. Unless there's a trap door that opens up onto the roof from downstairs, and that trap door is dalad al dalad. It's 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim wide. In that case, we now look at the roof as being chayrei rishos hayachid. We look at it as being kind of like holes that are accessible from the rishos hayachid, and then they also get a din of rishos hayachid. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kol Chav Zayin, mechitzas habayis nikaros. In order to say good asik mechitzasa, we need the outside walls of the house to be nicker, to be recognizable from the rooftop. Shekol gagoy shalahen chalokin hayu, their rooftops were flat, v'loy mishupayin, they were not pitched. Ukeshe'ein boilet hagag min aksalim v'lachutz, and as long as the roof does not extend over and beyond the outside walls of the house, nirin mechitzas habayis la'imnan al svas hagag, the outside walls of the house are visible to somebody standing on the edge of the roof up on top, kishemistaklim takas ragleim, when they look down beneath their feet. If they're standing flush with the edge of the roof and the roof does not extend beyond the walls of the house, when they look down, they could see the outside walls of the house. Then we could apply good asik b'chitzasa, and we could say that we extend halacha l'moshe b'sinai walls up and they surround the roof. But if the roof extends beyond the walls and it cuts them off, ein mechitzas habayis nirin. Then when you stand on the edge of the roof and you look down, you don't see the walls. Then we can't apply good asik b'chitzasa. Then the rooftop is not mukaf b'chitzas, and the rooftop becomes a karmelis. Well then, tiltal on the rooftop is going to be usher because you're in a karmelis. But if the roof does extend out beyond the walls, then you have a problem. Now, this Mishnah Berurah is a very famous Mishnah Berurah and a very yesodistic Mishnah Berurah. This Mishnah Berurah kind of gives a geder to that halacha, that if the roof extends beyond the walls, it cuts them off, and you can't say good asik b'chitzasa. What's the geder of that? What if it extends 1 millimeter beyond the walls? Is that a problem? Says the Mishnah Berurah, dafke kisha beilet arba tfachim. It has to extend at least 4 tfachim beyond the walls. Aval ein beilet arba tfachim. But if it extends a minute amount beyond the walls, but not 4 tfachim, hevek mechitzas nikaros, then it's still called mechitzas nikaros, and you could still apply good asik. It brings us down from the Magen Avram, the El Yerabba, v'ayin b'masha kasav de l'be'el, b'simin shin memhei sif tezayin b'bir halacha. I think I may have spoken out that Bir Halacha back then in Shid Mem Hey, where the Bir Halacha goes into this in a little bit more detail. There is a workaround over here, and that is if there is a trap door. It doesn't have to be a trap door, it's some kind of doorway from the house beneath up onto the roof, and that doorway is at least Daled al Daled, then the rooftop does not have to be mukaf bechitzos in order to get a status of Rishus HaYachid. Explains the Mishnah Berurah's Kal Tes, the Mishtamshin boy, if there's a trap door that allows you access from the Rishus HaYachid, from the house below, out onto the roof, and it makes the roof usable from the house below, v'nechshav kalagag k'choyrei Rishus HaYachid. Then the rooftop gets a din of choyrei Rishus HaYachid, and it becomes Rishus HaYachid. Nevertheless, loy mahani zeh ela lahata lehishtamish al gagoy bekelim sheshafsu b'saychai. The only thing that this is going to accomplish for us, the fact that there's a trap door that's going to turn the rooftop into choyrei Rishus HaYachid, you know what that's going to accomplish for us? It's going to accomplish that if there's a lawn chair on the rooftop, you could move it more than Daled Amos on the rooftop. Because it's Chayrei Rishus HaYachid, it has a din of Rishus HaYachid, you're allowed to be metaltal Yosef B'Daled Amos. The Yesh Alav Al Yidei Zeh Shem Rishus HaYachid, because we're going to treat it as a Rishus HaYachid. Ava, however, Lahalois Alav Kelim Sheshavsu Babayis, but you have this rooftop where you cannot apply good asik b'chitzasa because the roof extends out over beyond the walls and cuts them off, right? So you can't apply good asik b'chitzasa. And the only reason the rooftop has a din of Rishus HaYachid is because it's chayrei Rishus HaYachid, because it has a trap door whereby you can access it from the Rishus HaYachid below, right? So yes, it accomplishes that you could be metaltal more than Daled Amos on the rooftop. Aval, lahalois of kelim sheshafsu babayis. But to take a coffee cup that started off Shabbos down below inside the house and transfer it to the rooftop, aser kol zman shalei ervu yachad. That's going to remain aser unless these two houses join in a joint eruv chatzeros. Kemet she'eina mechitzos nikaros alav. Because Now you have these two rooftops that are completely open to each other. Even the Gag Godol is now going to be considered to be open to the Gag Katan. You know why? Because the only reason in the beginning of the Sif we said that we could view the Gag Godol as being cut off from the Gag Katan was because of this mechitza and this mechitza. But those mechitzas are good asik mechitzas. If the roof extends beyond the walls, then you don't have good asik mechitzas. So it's very nice that we give the rooftop a din of Rishus HaYachid because it's Chayrei Rishus HaYachid because it's a trap door that allows access from the Rishus HaYachid below. So yeah, it's a Rishus HaYachid. This is a Rishus HaYachid. This is a Rishus HaYachid. They're two different Rishus HaYachids. And they're open to each other. And they're completely open to each other. There are no gifufim, even from the perspective of the Gag Godol, because there's no good asik mechitza here, and there's no good asik mechitza here. So they're both nifratz b'miluay to each other, and they aser on each other. And unless this house and this house made a joint to Riva Chatzeros, right, you can't transfer a Keli Sheshavas Pabayas from downstairs to either one of these Chatzeros, because these two Chatzeros aser on each other. Okay, that concludes Siman Shin Ayin Daled. Let's move along and at least get started with Siman Shin Ayin Hey. We're going to see a very fascinating concept in this Siman. It's a difficult one to explain, but we'll do the best that we can. Says the Mechaber Shin Ayin Hey, Mahem Advarim Hashruya B'Chatzer She'enam Oisrim. What are different things, surfaces, that we can have in a chotzer, and they're not going to aser on the chotzer? Very vague, very ambiguous. We'll see what it means. Ubay Dal Seifim. Here we have 4 Seifim. So the first thing that I want to tell you is we have to visualize the scenario that we're dealing with here. I don't have my Dirshu Mishnah Berurah handy, but there is a very nice diagram. Very nice. There's a very basic diagram in the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah that shows us the case that we're going to be dealing with. Let me take a look here in the Oiz V'Hadar print of the Mishnah Berurah, where they have diagrams in the back. We're in Siman Shin Ayin Hey. Yes, there's a nice diagram in the back of the Oiz V'Hadar Mishnah Berurah as well. In my Oiz V'Hadar Mishnah Berurah, it's on page Lamed Aleph in the pictures in the back. It's the bottom left diagram. So, here's what we have. We have a multi-family, multi-story apartment building. So let's say we have an apartment building that has 2 floors. There are 4 apartments on the first floor, that's the ground floor, and there are 4 apartments upstairs in the second floor. Each one of the 4 apartments on the ground floor has a door that opens directly onto the chotzer. This building is in a chotzer. So the downstairs 4 units, and we're going to call those the batim, the houses. Those are the homes on the ground floor. They open directly onto the chotzer. Now right away we know that this chotzer needs an eruve chatzeros, right? Because this is 4 families, 4 independent Rishus HaYachids, that each open onto a common chotzer. So if you want to be able to transfer a Keli Sheshavas Babayis to the Chotzer, or a Keli Sheshavas B'Chotzer to the Bayis, or the Cholent from one Bayis to another one, right away we know that you need an Eruv Chatzeres. Okay. Now let's go to the second floor. On the second floor, there are another 4 apartments. We're going to refer to those apartments as the Aliyos, the second floor apartments. So the bottom ones are called the Batim, the second story ones are called the Aliyos. Now the Aliyos open up onto a mirpeset. What's a mirpeset? A porch. So there's a long porch that goes along the length of the front of this building. So downstairs there's 4 doors going into 4 units. Each door opens up onto the chotzer. Upstairs there are 4 units. Each unit has a door that opens up onto a joint mirpefet, porch, a long porch. Okay. Now that long porch is a shared porch. There's no walls, but cutting off one section of the porch from the other. It's an open porch that runs along the length of the front of this building. Now, if you live on the second floor, how do you get downstairs to the chutzner? You go out of your unit, you go onto the mirpeset. From the mirpeset, there's either a sulam, a ladder, or a staircase that goes down to the chutzner below. And that sulam, or that staircase, is at least dalet tvachim wide. So what is it? It's a pesach. It's a doorway. Okay, now, halachically, the way we're going to look at this is that we have two separate chatzeros over here. Downstairs, we have 4 units that open up onto one chutzner. Upstairs, we have 4 units, the aliyos, that open up onto another chutzner. Which chutzner? The mirpeset. The mirpeset is a common chutzner that serves the 4 upstairs aliyah units. Then there's a doorway, there's a pesach between these two chatzeros. There's a sulam or a staircase, which is a doorway. So we have 2 chatzeros, and they have a doorway that connects them. Now, what's the halacha when we have 2 chatzeros that are joined by a doorway? We know what the halacha is. They have their options open to them. If they want, they could make 2 separate deruvei chatzeros, or if they want, they could join in a joint deruvei chatzeros. So let's do the math based on the scenario that I just gave you. The 4 units downstairs, units 1 through 4, they could join in an eruvei chatzeros and make an eruvei chatzeros that joins their 4 units with the chutzner. If they do so, they could transfer a keli sheshavas babayis, so they could take a chair from one of their houses and they could take it out to the chutzner so that they could sit outside Shabbos Hiftalun and learn Pirkei Avos. They could take a cholent from unit number 1 and bring it to unit number 2 because they joined in an eruvei chatzeros. And they're totally independent of the upstairs. So could they take a cholent from one of the houses downstairs, go to the staircase, go upstairs, and bring it to a house? No. If they do that, they're taking a keli sheshavas babayis, they're taking their cholent pot that started off Shabbos in their house, in their downstairs chutzner, and they're transferring it to a house upstairs in a different chutzner. That would be awesome. Okay. The people upstairs could make their own joint eruvei chatzeros. So units 5 through 8 that are upstairs, they could make a joint eruvei chatzeros that connects their 4 units with their mirpeset. If they do so, they could take a chair from inside unit number 5 that started off Shabbos inside the house, inside the aliyah, inside unit number 5, and they could take it out to the porch. And they could learn Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, they could do Chazara outside on the porch. So they're transferring a keli sheshavas babayis out to the chutzner, the mirpeset. That's okay, because they made it a eruvei chatzeros. But the 2 did not join in a joint eruvei chatzeros. They don't have to, because the staircase that joins them is considered a pesach. It's not a pirza, it's not a breach, it's dalet tvachim wide, it's a pesach. If they want, they could join in a joint eruvei chatzeros. Then they could take the cholent from unit number 5, take it out to the mirpeset, take it down the staircase to the chutzner, and then take it into one of the batim, because they joined in a joint eruvei chatzeros. But if they don't want to, they don't have to. They can have two separate eruvei chatzeros. Now, what's unusual about this case is that, remember, let's say somebody from unit number 5, let's say somebody from one of the upstairs units wants to go out to the Rishus HaRabim. How's he going to get to the Rishus HaRabim? He's going to go out of his unit, onto the mirpeset. From the mirpeset, he's going to go down to the staircase. And now what? Now he's going to go through the chutzner to the opening from the chutzner to the Rishus HaRabim. So the people upstairs, right, have a drisas haregel. They have a right of way. They're walking through the downstairs chutzner. So in your classic case of two chatzeros that are separated by a wall with a Pesach between them. The standard case that we usually deal with is Chatzer A, Chatzer B are next to each other. Chatzer A has a gateway that goes out to Rishus Harabim. Chatzer B has a gateway that goes out to Rishus Harabim. There's a gate a fence between them. But the fence has a gate. Fine. Options are open. They have a doorway between them. If they want, they could join and enjoy the River Chatzeros. If they don't want, they don't have to. And they don't answer on each other. Why don't they answer on each other? Because there's a wall between them. The opening is a doorway. It's not a perza. Fine. In that case, I understand why they don't answer on each other. After all, right? Close the door. And then we have nothing to do with each other. And neither one has to have a drisas regel on the other one. They don't have to go through the other one to get out to the Rishus Harabim. They each have their own gateway to the Rishus Harabim. But in our case, the people in the upstairs chotzer, the people in the aliyas with their mirpeset chotzer, have a drisas regel on the downstairs chotzer. They gotta walk through the downstairs chotzer in order to get out to the Rishus Harabim. And yet, in a typical case, they don't answer on each other. Meaning, if the downstairs chotzer made in a Ruva Chatzeros, the downstairs chotzer made their own independent Ruva Chatzeros, and the upstairs aliyas with the mirpeset, they made their own independent Ruva Chatzeros, even though the people from upstairs are going to go out to the mirpeset down the steps and have a drisas regel and walk through the downstairs chotzer, they don't answer on the downstairs people. In that case. But we're going to see a case where they will answer on the downstairs chotzer. Against that backdrop, let's see how far we can get in Shin Ayin Hey, says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Mirpeset, the mirpeset that we have been talking about, Shu derech la'aliyos hapsuchim la, which is the means of access to the aliyos, to the upstairs units that open onto it. So the mirpeset is that long porch on the front of the second story. Vaimedes b'chotzer. And this second floor, this mirpeset, and the second floor apartments are situated in a chotzer. This whole building is in a chotzer. And the second floor, by the way, and it would be hard to imagine otherwise, the second floor is more than 10 tfachim above the ground level of the chotzer. Va'olim la bisulam. The way you get up to the mirpeset is with a ladder or with a staircase. Ubenei ha'aliyos yardim mimena lechotzer. The people who live upstairs, when they want to get out to Rishus Harabim, they go out of their aliyah, out of their second floor unit. They go out onto the mirpeset, and then they go down the sulam, the ladder or the stairs, to the chotzer, lechotzer. Va'ivrim l'Rishus Harabim, and that's how they get to the Rishus Harabim. Einam oisrim al bnei hachotzer. They do not answer on the downstairs chotzer. Again, meaning, if the people upstairs, the bnei ha'aliyos, if they made their own Ruva Chatzeros, their 4 units with their mirpeset, and the downstairs people from the bottom, the 4 units downstairs, they made their own Ruva Chatzeros with the chotzer, the fact that the people upstairs are going to go down the sulam to the chotzer downstairs, they don't answer on the Bnei HaChotzer. Why? The sulam teres pesach alav. Because the sulam is essentially a doorway between the 2 chatzeros. Vehevik is shtei chatzeros, so it's like 2 independent chatzeros, u pesach beineim, and they have a door between them. It's like chotzer A, chotzer B, with a fence between and a doorway in the fence, where we know that the halacha is she'em ratzu ma'arvim yachad. If they want, they have the option to join in a joint Ruva Chatzeros. V'im ratzu, and if they want, kol echad marav la'atzmai. Or if they want, each one could have an independent Ruva Chatzeros. Ubelvad sheye, and here comes the kicker. Ubelvad, but there is one very important caveat. Ubelvad sheye orvu kol b'nei mirpeset la'atzman. This only works if the people upstairs made in a Ruva Chatzeros kedei shetehe regel hamuteres b'mekoyma. so that they upstairs are mutter to transfer from their houses to their mirpeset upstairs. So again, the basic halacha that the Mechaber just laid out is that you have the 4 upstairs units with the mirpeset, you have the 4 downstairs units with the chotzer. Says the Mechaber, the people downstairs could make one independent Eruv Chatzeros. The people upstairs could make another independent Eruv Chatzeros. And they will not aser on each other. They're connected by the sulam that goes downstairs. So what? It's a Pesach. It's like Chotzer A, Chotzer B, separated by a fence with a Pesach, with a doorway that's bigger than Dalit Fachim and smaller than 10 Amos. Their options are wide open. If they want, they join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. If they don't want, they make 2 independent Eruv Chatzeros. The fact that they're connected by a doorway, they don't answer on each other. That's the basic halacha. The caveat that the Mechaber throws in, which is the part that's a little bit complicated that we're going to have to discuss, is the last phrase, the bilvad. This is only true if the people upstairs actually make an Eruv Chatzeros. And the words over here mean, ubilvad, this is only true, sheyeorvu kol b'nei merpeset la'atzman, that the upstairs people who share the merpeset made their own Eruv Chatzeros, kedei shetei regel hamuteres b'mekoyma, so that they are mutter upstairs. What does it mean that they're mutter upstairs? That upstairs it is mutter for them to transfer a keli shashavas babayis. They could take a coffee cup from inside one of their upstairs units and transfer it out onto their chotzer, aka their merpeset. If that's true, then the upstairs and the downstairs won't aser on each other. But let's say the people upstairs did not make an Eruv Chatzeros. Let's say the downstairs units made an Eruv Chatzeros. So they could take their coffee cups, keli shashavas babayis, from inside their units, and they could bring it out onto their chotzer. They made an Eruv Chatzeros. But the upstairs people did not make an Eruv Chatzeros. Now the upstairs people cannot transfer a keli shashavas babayis out to the merpeset, right? So now they're not a regel hamuteres b'mekoyma. Now they're not mutter in their place, in their chotzer. They're usser in their chotzer. Oh, if they don't make an Eruv Chatzeros, then now that they're usser upstairs, and they have a staircase that goes downstairs, and they have a drisas haregel through the downstairs chotzer, now they're going to aser on the downstairs chotzer, and they're going to void the Eruv Chatzeros of the downstairs. Because now the upstairs is going to aser on the downstairs. So you hear this? Obviously we see that this is something that requires explanation, right? The only difference between the two cases is that in one case the upstairs people made an Eruv Chatzeros, so they're mutter upstairs, then they don't answer on the downstairs. Either have a drisas haregel through the downstairs, so what? The sulam is a Pesach, it's only a Pesach, it's not a Pirza. Either going to walk through the chotzer, doesn't matter, we see them as a separate entity, they don't answer on the downstairs. But if the people upstairs don't make an Eruv Chatzeros, now they're a regel ha'asura b'mekoyma, now they're usher upstairs, now suddenly they're going to aser on the downstairs. So we're going to go into the Mishnah Berurah, and then we're going to explain. Interestingly enough, the Mishnah Berurah is not really going to explain the rationale for this. And it's a very intense sugya, and it's very complicated, but we'll try to give a basic understanding of this halacha. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Chavetz Chaim, Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Aleph. Einon oisrin al b'nei hachotzer. The people upstairs in the mirpeset, those people who live in the upstairs units, the aliyos that have a chotzer, their aliyos together with their mirpeset, they don't aser on the downstairs units. They don't aser on the batim and the chotzer, kishalo ervu yachad, if they did not join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. Ela b'nei ha'aliyos la'atzman u'b'nei ha'chotzer la'atzman. Rather, the upstairs people made their own independent Eruv Chatzeros, and the downstairs people made their own independent Eruv Chatzeros. V'lo yehevi kechatzer echad she'ervu b'nei chetzia la'atzman u'b'nei chetzia la'atzman da'asri ahadodi. We don't look at this as the upstairs and the downstairs all being part of one connected chutzner, and half of them one chutzner, one unified chutzner, and half of them making one Eruv Chatzeros, and the other half making another Eruv Chatzeros, where certainly they would aser on each other. Elehevi kishtei Chatzeros. Instead, we look at the upstairs and the downstairs as being totally two separate Chatzeros, albeit with a doorway between them, the sulam, or the staircase. Umayri and the Chavetz Chaim adds in, we have to be discussing a case, Kesha Mirpeset Gavoya Asar Tfachim Min HaChotzer. The upstairs Mirpeset has to be at least 10 Tfachim removed off of the ground level of the downstairs Chotzer. If that merpeset would be within 10 tfachim of the ground level of the downstairs chotzer, then it would automatically become part and parcel of the downstairs chotzer. So again, the reason we could divide the upstairs and the downstairs is that the upstairs merpeset is more than 10 tfachim off the ground level of the downstairs. Now we have the batim and the chotzer downstairs. That's going to be your Chotzer A. We have the Aliyos and the Merpeset upstairs. That's going to be the Chotzer B. The Sulam is going to be the doorway between Chotzer A and Chotzer B. Ice Cotton Bays, the Mechaber said they can each make an independent Eruv Chatzeros. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ice Cotton Bays, Ritzaner Loimar, Umutal Taltal Afilu Klei Abayis LaChotzer. If the downstairs people make their independent Eruv Chatzeros, they could take a Pirkei Avos from inside one of the batim, inside one of the downstairs units, and take it out to the Chotzer to learn on Shabbos afternoon. V'chein klei aliyah lamar peset. And so to the people upstairs, they could take a Pirkei Avos that started off Shabbos inside one of the aliyahs, inside one of the upstairs unit, and take it out to the Merpeset to learn on the Merpeset, because the Merpeset is their Chotzer, and they made it a Eruv Chatzeros. Avo klei abayis lamar peset. But to take a chair from one of the batim, one of the downstairs unit, go up the sulam and bring it to the merpeset, oy klei aliyah lachotzer, or to take a coffee cup that started off Shabbos inside one of the aliyahs, inside one of the upstairs units, and to take it downstairs to the chotzer, aser, that's aser. You're taking a keli sheshavas babayis, and you're taking it and transferring it to a different chotzer, to a chotzer that you don't have an erev with. Kevin Shalei Aser, Kevin Shalei Ervu Yachad, that would be Aser, since they did not join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. And here we have, right, the kicker of this sif, the kicker of sif aleph, is this caveat that the Mechaber gave, Ubelvad Sheyeyarvu. This is only going to work. When are we going to say that the upstairs people, the upstairs chotzer, does not aser on the downstairs chotzer, even though they have a drisas haregel through the downstairs chotzer, right? Remember that. They have a drisas haregel. They are always going to have to go through the downstairs chotzer to get out to the Rishus HaRabim. When do they not aser on the downstairs chotzer if they each made independent Eruv Chatzeros? That's only if the people upstairs actually made their own Eruv Chatzeros. Ubelvad sheyarvu. Return Loimar. What the Mechaber wants to say is, if the people upstairs did not make their own Eruv Chatzeros, so the people downstairs made an Eruv Chatzeros, they could take a Mishnayos, a Keli Sheshavas Babayis downstairs, and take it out to their Chotzer, because they made it a Eruv Chatzeros. But the upstairs people, for whatever reason, chose not to make an Eruv Chatzeros. In that case, they are a regel ha'asura b'mekayman. They, upstairs, are not allowed to transfer a keli sheshavas babayis to their chotzer. They can't take something from one of the aliyahs out to the merpeset. If they didn't make their own independent Eruv Chatzeros, and therefore they are regel ha'asura b'mekayma, Oiseres gam kein ala chotzer letaltal b'soicha miklei abayis. Now, the fact that they have a drisas regel to go through the downstairs chotzer, now they're going to aser on the downstairs chotzer. Because since the only way for the people upstairs, the merpeset people, the only way for them to get to the Rishus Harabim is by using their drisas regel through the downstairs chotzer, hevelei kechotzer zel lifnim mizeh, she'ein loy derech acher ki im al yedei chotzer hachitzayna. This now becomes a case that's covered by the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Ayin Ches. In Siman Shin Ayin Ches, we discuss not an upper level chotzer and a lower level chotzer. In Shin Ayin Ches, we discuss a chotzer that is within another chotzer. So you've got a big outer chotzer, and then between this big outer chotzer and a smaller inner chotzer, there's a wall, there's a gate, and there's a doorway in the gate. So these are two separate chatzeros that are separated by a kaisel. It's a chotzer A and a chotzer B. What's unique about that case is the same thing that's unique about this case. The inside chotzer has a drisas regel on the outside chotzer in order to go through the outside chotzer and get to the Rishus Harabim. So essentially, it's the same case. Here we're talking about an upper level and a lower level. Over there we're talking about one chotzer inside another chotzer. And in Shin Ayin Ches, says the Mishnah Berurah, the Kaimalon, L'kamon b'simin Shin Ayin Ches Siv Beis, if the inner chotzer did not make their own independent deruvei chatzeros, tahavale regel asura b'mkaima, so that they are a regel asura b'mkaima inside their inner chotzer. They're not allowed to transfer a keli sheshavas babayis to their chotzer or a keli sheshavas bachotzer into their bayis, or from one of their batim to another bayis. So they're a regel asura b'mkaima inside their chotzer. Oisrin al hachitzayna, then their drisas regel is going to aser on the outside chotzer. Now again, like I pointed out to you, interestingly enough, the Chavetz Chaim chose not to attempt to explain the rationale for this very fascinating halacha. If the upstairs chotzer, the aliyas with the merpeset, if they made in a ruvei chatzeros, their drisas regel doesn't aser on the downstairs chotzer. They're a regel on muteris b'mekaima, they don't aser. If the upstairs chotzer did not make an ruvei chatzeros, they're a regel asura b'mekaima, now they aser on the downstairs chotzer. Why? The Achrayim struggle with this. There's a lot of different pshatim that are written. Perhaps the simplest pshat that I've seen, perhaps, is as follows. The whole underpinning of why one chotzer would aser on the other chotzer is because they're two separate entities, right? The whole underpinning of a ruvei chatzeros, we have multiple batim in a chotzer, each individual rishos hayachids. We have a common chotzer, two different flavors, rishos hayachid. We need to remedy the situation. Chazal aser transfer. How do we remedy the situation? We make everybody one happy, unified family by creating a ruvei chatzeros. Now everything is one, right? Problem over here is you've got two. You've got two chatzeros. You've got an upstairs chotzer and a downstairs chotzer. They made two separate ruvei chatzeros. There's a drisas regel from the upstairs to the downstairs. If we're going to look at the upstairs and the downstairs as intermingling because of that drisas regel, then they're going to aser on each other because they're two entities that are sharing, right? I got a drisas regel. I'm upstairs. I got a drisas regel. I got to come through your chotzer. So now I'm sharing your chotzer, but I'm not together with you in the ruvei chatzeros. That would be the problem. How does regel muteris b'mkaima or regel asur b'mkaima affect that equation? So one pshat that's given is, it's interesting because it's slightly counterintuitive. If the upstairs makes in a ruvei chatzeros, so then the ruvei chatzeros that the upstairs made forms them into one very significant unified entity. So they're one unified entity. The downstairs is one unified entity. Then we're not troubled with the Dirshu regel. Why? Because the upstairs is a very potent, significant, separate, unified entity in its own right. The downstairs also is. We can overlook the Dirshu regel. We don't look so much at that Dirshu regel. All it is a right of way. I'm not using the downstairs chutzner. I just gotta walk through it, right? It's kind of like Klal Yisrael to Edom in the Midbar. Rak ever baraglai. You know, I just gotta pass through. I'm not using the chutzner. I have a chutzner. I'm good. I have a chutzner upstairs. We're mutter b'mkaima. We made it a Ruvei Chatzeros. I have a merpeset. If I want to learn Pirkei Avos, I have a merpeset to learn Pirkei Avos on. I can take my mishnayos from my house onto my merpeset. I'm good. I've got an upstairs chutzner. I don't need your chutzner. I have nothing to do with your chutzner. If the upstairs does not join in an Ruvei Chatzeros, that, so to speak, kind of makes the upstairs chutzner, the aliyas with the merpeset, it makes it weak. It's a reisa. It makes it shvach. It's not a unified chutzner. It's not. Therefore, now we don't look at them as being a potent, separate entity. We look at the upstairs as chaos. We look at the upstairs a bunch of separate units, a merpeset. Nothing is unified. When they go downstairs, weiter, nothing is unified. They didn't make a joint in Ruvei Chatzeros. They didn't make a separate in Ruvei Chatzeros. Now they can aser on the downstairs. Kol zman that they have in the Ruvei Chatzeros, the regel muteres b'mkaima, we look at them as a whole separate thing. If they're not unified by the Ruvei Chatzeros, if they're a regel or iseres b'mkaima, then we don't look at them as being a potent separate entity. We look at it as being haphazard. If it's haphazard, then they aser on the downstairs. Okay, I know we're going very long today, but I wanted to at least a nice piece of Sif Beis, otherwise we're going to fall behind. Let's move along to Sif Beis, says the Mechaber. Now, Sif Beis over here, Shin Ayin Hey Sif Beis, is going to take us back to Siman Shin Ayin Beis in certain ways. Back in Siman Shin Ayin Beis, in Sif Vav, I believe it was. In Sif Vav, if you remember, Shin Ayin Beis Sif Vav was a very, very complex Sif. And over there, we tackled the issue of shared spaces, areas that are shared between two chatzeros. And the question of what happens when two chatzeros have an equal claim to something like the top of the wall separating two chatzeros. What happens when the claim is not equal, when it's noach teshmishtei for one chatzer and it's not noach teshmishtei for another chatzer? And that's really the topic that we're going to be dealing with here in Sif Beis. Over there in Shin Ayin Beis, we were talking about two chatzeros separated by a wall. Here, we're talking about an upstairs chutzner and a downstairs chutzner. But again, we're going to struggle with how do we deal with areas in the chutzner that are somehow shared between these two chatzeros, between the downstairs chutzner and the upstairs chutzner. Who gets to the shared area? Who does not get the shared area? How extensive is the isser on the shared area to the chutzner that doesn't get it, etc., etc.? Let's dive in. Says the Mechaber. So we just saw in Sif Aleph, the upstairs chutzner, the downstairs chutzner, they have the option to make two independent Ruvei Chatzeros. So, says the Mechaber, what if that's what they did? They did not join in a joint Ruvei Chatzeros. They made two independent Ruvei Chatzeros. The yesh b'chutzner, now, downstairs on the ground level of the chutzner, there is a tail. A tail is a mound. Oy amud, or there's a pillar. Shehu meshutif bein shneim. The ownership of this tail or this amud is joint ownership. It's owned by both the downstairs and the upstairs. Okay, now the question is, how do we deal with the surface of this tail or this amud? Who does it belong to? Does it belong to the who does it belong to in the context of the halachas of Eruv Chatzeros? Is it part of the downstairs chotzer? Is it part of the upstairs chotzer? So this is going to depend on size, height, access, etc., etc. Says the Mechaber. Im einam gevoyim asar tvachim. If this tail or this amud that's standing on the ground level of the chotzer is a less than 10 tfachim tall, and even though the Mechaber doesn't write this out clearly, but Mishnah Berurah will spell it out for us, it's less than 10 tfachim off the ground level of the chotzer. It's also less than 10 tfachim removed in height from the upstairs. So if you're downstairs on the chotzer, you could reach up to the top of this amud. It's less than 10 tfachim tall. If you're upstairs in the merpeset, which is the upstairs chotzer, and you reach down, you don't have to reach down more than 10 tfachim. So the surface of the tail or the amud is within 10 tfachim of height, both to the downstairs people and to the upstairs people. And einam gvayim asar tfachim, harei elu nechshavim bein hachotzer ubein hamerpeset. So then what happens over here is this surface is joint to both the downstairs and the upstairs. Equal claim, equal access. It's considered to be part of the chotzer, both to the downstairs chotzer and the upstairs chotzer. Just like in Shin Ayin Beis, we spoke about a case in Shin Ayin Beis where you have a wall separating the two chatzeros, and we said, what if the wall is 10 tfachim tall on both sides? The grade of both chatzeros was the same, so that if you approach the wall from either chatzer, the wall is 10 tfachim tall. So we said the top of the wall is now shared. It's part of the chotzer, but it's part of both chatzeros. All right, what's the halacha? Well, from chotzer to chotzer, you're always allowed to transfer, even without an eruv chatzeros. So in Shin Ayin Beis Sivav, we said the halacha is, if there's an apple on top of the wall, you can take it off and bring it to either chotzer. If there's a keli sheshavas b'chotzer on either side, if there's something that started off Shabbos in the chotzer on either side, you could pick it up and you could put it on top of the wall. Because the very first opening of Siman Shin Ayin Beis, kol agagois v'achatzerois v'akarpifois kulon rishos achasein. To transfer from one chotzer to another chotzer, you don't need an eruv chatzeros for a keli sheshavas b'chotzer. So the top of that wall, we said in Shin Ayin Beis, is part of the chotzer. Problem is, it might be part of both chatzeros, right? It's part of chotzer A, it's also part of chotzer B. But the transfer between the chatzeros is no problem. But neither chotzer is allowed to transfer a keli sheshavas b'bayis to the top of that kaisel. Because since both chatzeros have an equal claim to the top of the kaisel, they aser on each other in the context of a keli sheshavas b'bayis. So could you take a mishnayos from a house in chotzer A, bring it through the chotzer and put it on top of the wall? No, that's a keli sheshavas b'bayis. You're putting it onto the top of the wall, which is chotzer, but it might be part of chotzer B. So you're transferring a keli sheshavas b'bayis in chotzer A to the chotzer of chotzer B without an eruv chatzeros. You're not allowed to do that. So to vice versa, from chotzer B to the top, from a house in chotzer B to the top of the kaisel. You can't do that. That's what we learned in Shin Ayin Beis Sivav. Same halacha over here. Says the Mechaber, Harei elu nechshavim bein hachotzer ubein hamerpeset ushneim asurim lo hitzi sham kelib shababotim. This is that case. Here we're talking about upstairs and downstairs. You have a tail or an amud. The bottom chotzer and the top chotzer have equal access to the top surface. The surface of that tail or the surface of that amud is chotzer. So to transfer a keli sheshavas b'chotzer to the top of that tail or that amud from either chotzer is fine. That's not a problem. Kol hachatzeros v'agagos v'karpifos kulon rishos hakasein. But neither chotzer is going to be allowed to transfer a keli sheshavas b'bayis to the top of that tail or the top of that amud, because they're going to aser on each other. Ushneim asurim lahitzi sham kelim shebabotim. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Dalet. Bein Shneihem. If you have over here the ownership of the tail of the Amud is joint ownership, the Imu Shalechad Behem, because if the tail of the Amud is owned by by either the downstairs or the upstairs exclusively, Harehi Berushusa Dechad, it's owned by one, the Einam Oisrim Alav B'chal Gavni, and then they would not aser on each other. Ois Kat Nehei, Einam Gavayim Asar Tvachim, says the Mishnah Berurah, very important Mishnah Berurah, Aklal Bazeh, the rule that's going to guide Sif Beis is the same rule that guided Shirayin Beis Sivav. Aklal Bazeh, the Kol Shala Echad Tashvisha Benachas, whichever chotzer has easier access to the surface of that tail or that obed, Benachas, in the bracket says the Chofetz Chaim, Hainu Bekal, meaning easy access. Ula Sheni Bekoshe, if the other chotzer has more difficult access. Now understand, over here we're talking about something that's 10 tefachim tall. There's no difficult access here, but it's relative. If one chotzer has a relatively easier access than the other one, loy mikri rak rishos loy seishet tashmisha benachas. So then we're going to give ownership of the top of the tail or the amud to the chotzer that has easier access. Ve'ein hasheni yachal eser alav, and then the other chotzer is not going to be able to aser on them. Avalim shneim shavim. But if they both have equal access, like in the case that we just learned in the Mechaber, where the tail is less than 10 tefachim removed from either the upstairs or the downstairs, equal claim, whether they're the same in that they both have just as easy access, or maybe they both have the same, so to speak, difficult access. But they're equal. If they have equal claim, shaykh l'shneim, then it's going to belong to both of them. And what happens if it belongs to both of them? Umemela oisrim zalzel loitzi loitze mokaim miklei abayis kevin chalei yachad. When you have equal claim, like shinayin beis of wall separating top of the wall, it's the same to both sides, equal access. Now you cannot transfer a keli sheshavas babayis to the top of the wall from a house in either chotzer. So too here, you have the tail, the amud that's coming up from the downstairs chotzer. If it's equal ownership and equal access upstairs and downstairs, then they're going to aser on each other. If they aser on each other, keli sheshavas babayis from downstairs cannot go to the top of the tail or the amud. Keli sheshavas ba'aliyah upstairs cannot go to the surface of the tail or the amud because they're going to aser on each other. But a keli sheshavas b'chotzer could go to the top of the tail or the amud either from the merpeset upstairs or from the chotzer downstairs. Ve'ezeh mikri benachas ve'ezeh b'koshe. What are we calling relatively easy access, or what are we calling relatively difficult access? Mispar b'gemara. The kol shetzarich l'tashmisha is zrika. Whenever, in order to use something, you need zrika, you need to throw. Dainu she'atei lo ya'omid gavaya mimenu asar tefachim v'tzarich lizreg sham, meaning that it is 10 tefachim removed in height, so that you have to throw something there. Very difficult to understand. 10 tefachim, 37 inches. 40 inches. You don't need to throw something to get something on top of a tail or an amud that's 10 tefachim tall. What can I tell you? This is a Gemara in Erev and a Pei Gimel Amud Beis. Somehow the Gemara is saying that that's called Tashmisha B'zrika. I'm not sure why. Shilshul. Or if you need to lower something. Dahainu. Sha'amakamahu namach bimenu asar tefachim. Right? From downstairs, from ground level, we say if it's 10 tefachim high or taller, that's tashmish hayidei zrika. From upstairs, if the surface is removed more than 10 tefachim beneath you, we say that you need shilshul. You need to lower something. That becomes tashmisha b'kosha. Ukishareis l'shamish l'sach l'shalshul l'rida l'sham, kol zeh mikri kosha. Ve'u pachas me'asar tefachim, hein b'zrika v'hein b'shilshul, mikri b'nachas. There are some times that we're going to call tashmishtoi bekoshe difficult usage, even if the height differential is less than 10 tfachim. Going, for example, she'oisei amadoy atel muflag berichuk makim mimenu arba tfachim v'tzarech lizrek ba'avir. Let's say you have an amud that is within 10 tfachim of height to the merpeset. So I'm on the merpeset, I take a measuring tape, and I lower it down to the surface of the tail. It's 9 tfachim. So that should be called tashmishta benakas. But it could be still tashmishta bekasha. You know how? If laterally it's moved away from the merpeset 4 tfachim or more, now even though vertically it's removed less than 10 tfachim, but horizontally, laterally it's removed more than 4 tfachim, that also creates a tashmishta bekasha situation. Ois Katan Vav, the case that we had so far in the Mechaber was, Einam Gevayim Asara Tfachim. The tail is not 10 Tfachim tall. It starts at the ground level downstairs in the Chotzer. It's not more than 10 Tfachim tall, Mina Oretz. V'gam, and here's where the Mishnah Berurah puts in between the lines what the Mechaber did not spell out, V'gam min merpeset shalamaylamayhem. Also from the upstairs merpeset above, Ein nomuch mimena Asara Tfachim. It's not removed in height more than 10 tfachim. So from the merpeset, the upper surface of the tail of the amud is within 10 tfachim beneath. Now it's noyach tashmishte to the downstairs and to the upstairs, and they have joint ownership. So now, equal claim, they answer on each other. What does that affect? Now, neither one could transfer a keli sheshavas babayis to the top of that tail or that amud. If, however, from the upstairs merpeset, the top surface of that tail or amud is removed by more than 10 tfachim, if I got to go down 12 tfachim to get to the top of that amud, but from the ground level it's 10 tfachim or less, then we would give it to the Bnei Chotzer. They have easier access. The lehem tashmisha benachas v'lebnei merpeset hainu anshe aliyah shebebatem niftachim lamerpeset v'eskufas mischem shavala bekasha. Then the downstairs has noach tashmishtei. The upstairs does not have noach tashmishtei. Then it would belong to the downstairs. Ois Katan Zayin. In the case that the Mechaber laid out so far, it was equal access. It's less than 10 to either one. And it's within 4 tfachim of either one. So it's noach tashmishtei to both, equal claim. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Zayin, u'shneim asurim. Now they're going to answer on each other. V'davka kishoya hatel v'amud samach la'merpeset b'saycha bar tfachim. Remember, the tail, the upper surface of the tail of the amud, cannot be laterally removed from the merpeset by more than 4 tfachim. If it is, it becomes kosher tashmishtei to the bnei merpeset. Dema yurechaykim b'menu arba tfachim im kein tashmish merpeset olav bekosher v'achotzer benachas v'noistim oisai lebnei ha-chotzer. Okay, we're going to pause over here. We'll continue with this theme in the next chair. But again, we already have the rule. The rule over here is the same rule as Shin Ayin Beis Sivav. When there's an equal claim, that's when we run into a problem where we're going to aser both chatzeros to transfer a keli sheshavas babayis to that surface, because they're going to aser on each other. But they're only going to aser on each other in the context of kelim sheshavas babayis. They're not going to aser on each other in the context of kelim sheshavas b'chotzer, because chotzer to chotzer is not a problem. Where do we potentially have a problem of kelim sheshavas b'chotzer? That's when we have unequal claims. That's when we had the Machlokes, the Mechaber, the Rashba, and we'll deal with that a little bit more tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for Liban HaTorah. This list of Liban HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua's Refuas, Parnasa, Cheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichen to see the BS Kol Tzedek, B'meher v'yameinu, Amen. Be well.